There I am. All right. Can you guys hear me too? Is that working okay? Is the audio working now? And I guess, can you see me? I can see myself, so I think that that's working. Okay. Sorry about that. I don't know if it was my internet or what was going on. So, all right, we're going to jump in. Sorry I wasted a couple minutes of your time there. But tonight's session for AP Psych Review is going to be all about the bio unit. Last neurons and neurotransmitters. So if you missed that, make sure you hit the replay because those are pretty important parts to this unit as well. And today we're going to continue talking about the brain, body systems, and then how genetics all play a role in that. So just as a reminder, I always like to tell you, you guys can interact with me in a couple of ways here. On the bottom, kind of right-hand side of your screen, you can ask a question. You just click on that and type your question in, and it will kind of put it in a queue in a line for me and notify me. And then I can kind of answer it as I have a chance to. Otherwise, we've been using the chat a little bit on the right-hand side. Feel free to ask questions or talk to each other in the chat as we go through things as well. And then sometimes I post polls or other information as well. But today we're going to mostly just be on the question and answer part. So let's jump right in. Just as we always do, I like to just show you what's coming up. So next week, if you are registered for the sessions, we have altered states of consciousness. Specifically, we're going to talk about sleep and drugs. So we're moving out of the bio unit. And maybe in the chat right there on the right-hand side, those of you that are here, if you want to tell me what unit you're in, I just like to know where we're at. Sometimes this is good review. Sometimes this is good test prep. And maybe if you have other things that you're interested in going over, if you see on here something that we aren't covering that you feel like would be really important, I could probably throw it into one of our upcoming sessions as well. So we've got states of consciousness, and then we've got sensation and perception, two different, it's a pretty big unit. Sensation and perception, yeah, pretty big unit coming up. So I don't know, maybe we could, maybe skip around a little bit and do sensation perception next week. Really up to what you guys are kind of feeling, if this is still just good review for you, even if you're outside of the bio unit. Yeah, I don't know, kind of let me know. And we can adjust the sessions accordingly. So yeah, that's where we're going. Where we're at today then is reviewing or going over stuff in the bio unit. And so 8 to 10% of the AP test, this is a heavy hitter. And it seems to be this unit is the one that my students struggle with sometimes, just because I think there's a lot of new information in it. And so even if you're past the test for this unit, it might be useful to go over some of this information as review. So like I said, we talked about neurotransmitters and neurons, and we're going to talk about the brain and stuff tonight. So the first part that we're going to focus on is the nervous system. And so last time, like I said, we talked about neurons. The nervous system is made up of nerves, which are made up of neurons. So we're kind of going bigger picture here with the parts of our body. And so the nervous system is basically how our body sends and receives messages back and forth. And so it's an electrochemical network. And last time we also reviewed that some neurons, that communication within neurons is more electrical, and then in between neurons, it's chemical. So they're electrochemical messengers. And the two main components of the nervous system are the central and the peripheral nervous system. And if you know what peripheral means, it should give you a good idea of what the peripheral nervous system is made up of. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. But the big thing you need to know here is that there are three main types of neurons that make up the nervous system. So if we start kind of with the outskirts of our body with like the sensory neurons, those are the things that bring the messages in. So I like to just use my hand as an example. If I feel something, that message gets brought inward by my sensory or my afferent neurons. And we did go over this a little bit last week, so I'm going to kind of go fast through this. But afferent starts with an A, so that helps me remember that that's what starts the process of the messaging, and it brings the message inward. So it takes the message from my body's tissue and receptors inward to the brain and spinal cord for processing. We have a few million sensory neurons located all over our body. Then when that message hits our spinal cord and our brain, it goes to the interneurons. They're the in-between, in-between. And that's where the sensory input turns to a motor output. So information is processed in the brain and then sent outward via our communication system. There's billions and billions of interneurons, tons and tons and tons of them, making up our brain and our spinal cord. And then the output is taken through the motor neurons. So that's how the message gets sent outward. So if I feel something sticky on my hand, that message goes in with the sensory, the interneurons process it, and then the motor output sends the message outward, and I pull my hand away because it feels icky and I don't like it. So that's basically how the nervous system responds to something. More specifically then, looking at where all of our neurons come from, this is kind of an interesting, and I don't know if you guys have seen this before or not. I always like this. He looks funny, but this is called the Cortex Man. And if you haven't seen him before, basically what this is demonstrating is where most of our neurons and things are located. So sensory is the red on the left side, and motor is the blue on the right. And so you can see his hands are really big, his tongue and his lips are really big. And if you think about sensory, where our bodies are the most sensitive, that makes sense. His genitals are also kind of large. And so if you think about the parts of our body that we're using in a sensitive nature, like our hands have to be kind of sensitive so we don't hurt ourselves, our mouth and lips and tongues because of talking and eating and everything like that, and then genitals for obvious reasons. So basically this guy has the enlarged parts. Where we have more sensory neurons is where the parts of his body that are bigger. And then on the right-hand side is where we have more motor neurons. And so again, it's similar. His hands are big, but they're even bigger because think about everything that we do with our hands and how reliant we are on our fingers and our hands for doing things. And so that's why they're huge. We have tons and tons of motor neurons there, which allow us to do minute little things with a tweezers or tying our shoes or any other sort of fine detail things that we're able to do. So I just like this because I think it's a good visual of oh, so that's where a lot of our neurons are. And it makes kind of sense if you think about how we use those parts of our body that they would be located in those areas. So just a visual to help you kind of see where our different neurons are focused on. Okay, and then moving on more to just a general overview of the nervous system. I think this visual is really good. It kind of shows you how the nervous system breaks down into parts. And so we have the nervous system, that's our umbrella term at the top. And then we have two main components of the nervous system, the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. And so central, I think, makes sense. It's the center right down the middle of our body, and that's the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral, if you think about peripheral vision, it's the outsides of our vision. It's everything else outside of the brain and the spinal cord. And then the peripheral nervous system is made up of the somatic and the autonomic. And then the autonomic breaks down even further into the sympathetic and the parasympathetic. And I'm going to go over all of these more in depth. So this is just a handy little chart to kind of help you visualize which parts of the nervous system go where. And so we're going to do some little kind of dance moves, not dance moves, this isn't really dancing, I don't know, moves to help us remember specifically all of these parts of the nervous system. So the central nervous system, again, that's where all the interneurons are, inside, in the middle. And to help us remember, we're just going to do the kitty cat here, right down the middle. That helps us remember that the central nervous system is everything right down the middle, from the brain down to the spinal cord, brain, spinal cord. Everything right down the middle of our body. And then the big thing you need to know is that's where interneurons are located. That's where the processing of those messages, input and output, happens. Okay, so that is the central nervous system. So we already covered the right side of that visual. And then we're going to move on to the peripheral nervous system, and I like this one. And so it's the outside. We're going to do our jazz hands here, like Jimmy Fallon here, jazz hands. And that's kind of because it's the outside of our body. It's everything else, from your toes to your fingers, fingers to your toes. And you can see that picture there is a network of all of the different nerve nerves that we have traveling outward in our body and the nerve endings. And so the peripheral nervous system, again, think like your peripheral vision. It's the outsides, and it's the connection basically from the central nervous system to the rest of our body. So the central nervous system is kind of the main messenger carrying the messages to the peripheral nervous system, which sends them outward to the rest of our body. All right, so then the peripheral breaks down into the autonomic and the somatic, and we'll start with the somatic. The main thing that you need to know about the somatic nervous system is that it's our voluntary movement of like our muscles. So like we're doing the robot, right? Like those are voluntary. I'm telling my body to do these things. They're not reflexes. They're not happening unless I tell my body to do them. And so it's basically just any sort of movement that we end up making. That is the somatic nervous system. So comparing that to like the robot, I think might be a useful way to remember that. And then we've got the autonomic nervous system. So we're still under peripheral, just the other one. And that takes us to some Britney Spears here. The autonomic nervous system is yes, I like Tyler's jazz hands they just put there. The self-regulated action of internal organs and glands. So autonomic kind of sounds like automatic, although you need to be able to differentiate between those words, but it might help you remember. So it's like my heart rate, my breathing. It's all these things that I don't have to tell my body to do. They're just always happening. My glands are functioning. My heart is beating. My digestion happens. I'm breathing. And while I can kind of override those things, like I can hold my breath, eventually I have to start breathing again and the autonomic nervous system takes over. So, yeah, basically like anything that little image shows you, there's a bunch of different things happening there. But I like the dance. It's the Britney Spears. That's probably way too old for you guys, that video, but she's doing the heartbeat dance. So thinking about your heartbeat should help you remember that the autonomic nervous system is all of those automatic functionings in our bodies. And then we look at the autonomic nervous system. That breaks down into two further systems. And the first is the sympathetic nervous system. And so the sympathetic nervous system is when we're like scared or aroused or alert in some way. And so that's like the running man. When you like run and you're getting your heart rate up, right? That gets your heart rate going. That's the sympathetic nervous system. And so it could be your pupils are dilating, your mouth goes dry, your heart starts racing, your muscles are tense, lots of things like that. So anytime, like if you think about like if you're watching a scary movie and you get scared, all those things that are happening, that's your sympathetic nervous system kicking in and getting you ready for action, ready to fight, ready to fend off whatever's coming at you. And so the running man gets your heart up, gets those things going. That should help you remember that. So the very last system then that needs to be looked at is the parasympathetic nervous system. And it's basically the opposite then of the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic is arousing, parasympathetic calms you down. It's like yoga. It brings it all in at the end. It returns your body to like a neutral, natural state. So your heart slows down, your pupils constrict instead of dilate. You return to like having saliva in your mouth. Your stomach starts digesting again, because when you are aroused, your stomach actually stops digesting because all of your body's energy is focused on whatever it is that you're nervous or fending yourself off about. Another thing helping you remember parasympathetic nervous system. If you think parachute, a parachute slows you down so you don't crash into the earth if you're skydiving. The parasympathetic nervous system slows you down and helps you return to a state of calm. So parachute, parasympathetic, that might help you kind of differentiate, because a lot of times people mix those two up. So in review, we've got all of these different dance moves here that might be useful. Just another way to kind of help you remember things. I think if there's always, I always tell my students to make connections to the material. And so even if it's a silly dance move, if it helps you remember it, like go ahead and think about it that way, because giving that connection to the material makes it more meaningful, I think. Any questions about the nervous system? I have a question for you guys to think about. Oh, it's doing this thing. There we go. So an example to consider when you are taking an AP Psych test. So let's pretend you're nervous, that you're not well prepared for your AP Psych test. Tell me just in the chat, put down, like whoever wants to, a couple of things that are happening in my body while I'm taking the test and I'm nervous. I'm not very well prepared for it. So let's just throw some ideas into the chat about what's happening, what body system is active, what sorts of things might be happening as you prepare for that. Let's see if anyone has any ideas in the chat. Yep, heart rate is beating faster. It would be, yep, your autonomic would be going for sure, because that's got your heart rate and your breathing and all of those things that you're not consciously like controlling. You might start sweating like this guy in the picture. Yep, sympathetic. Yeah, all of those things would be going. And then you finish the test and you're like, hey, that wasn't so bad. And so then our parasympathetic is going to kick in after the test. It's going to slow my heart rate. I'm going to start feeling more calm and back to like my normal neutral state. Good job, guys. All right, so any other questions about nervous system? You can throw it in the ask a question box there at the bottom. Otherwise, we're going to move on and start talking about the endocrine system. Endocrine system, I don't have a ton about this. I think it's kind of straightforward. And there's not a ton of parts that you have to remember. I think the main thing that you have to remember is the endocrine system is a hormone messenger. So while the neurons are electrochemical, the endocrine system is all about hormones. They're still messengers, but they're just a different kind of messenger. And so our body is made up of glands that secrete hormones, and those hormones travel through the blood. So that's how messages via the endocrine system are sent. And then as they go through your bloodstream, they affect the tissues, including the brain. So depending like where the messages start and things like that. And so we would say that the endocrine system mainly controls the 3 Fs: fighting, food, and fornicating. So kind of controls like basic drives almost, those sorts of things. And the big thing that you have to know about the endocrine system, this is kind of like a question that I see pretty regularly, is that it initially travels slower than the nervous system. So like if something scares you, the hormones that might kick in might take effect slower than what the nervous system kicks in. But because it's traveling through your bloodstream, it also takes longer for it to go away. So the message lasts longer. So when our endocrine system kicks in, it's slower than the nervous system, but it lasts longer because of how it goes through your blood, and those hormones have to dissipate before the message completely leaves your body. And I'd say that's one of the big keys that you have to know, that a hormone is a chemical messenger and that it controls kind of those 3 Fs, and then it's slower but lasts longer. I think those are like really the 3 key things. And then if you look at that diagram there, we're going to talk about the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland a little bit later. But the pituitary gland, we like to call it the master gland, meaning basically it controls or sends messages to most other glands in your body. And so it's kind of like the big guy in charge. He sends all of the messages to everywhere else as they go. So just kind of knowing that. Oh, excuse me. It's been a long day. All right, so that's really it for the endocrine system. I think, like I said, those are the big 3 things that you need to know as far as what might be tested on. And then this is a lot of information. So we're going to go through it step by step. I like this visual diagram, even though it doesn't look very fancy. I think it really tells us a lot of information. And so we're going to go step by step through all of the parts of the brain that you need to know, and kind of what the gist of each one is that you need to know. And so first and foremost, the big thing that I think you need to know is that all of these parts of the brain do many things. But for the purposes of AP psychology, you only need to know a few of them. So like I always tell my kids to not Google, because if you like Google cerebellum, you're going to get a huge Wikipedia article of all these different things that you don't need to know, when in reality, you just need to know movement and balance for the cerebellum. So I would really try and avoid kind of Googling and Wikipedia-ing, because you're going to get too much stuff that's going to confuse you. So for the purposes of AP Psych, these are the things that you need to know about the brain and about the parts of the brain. So let's talk a little bit first about the older brain structures. And so when I say older, like evolutionarily speaking, these are the first parts of our brain that we've developed and that develop over time. And so the brain stem is really the first and foremost oldest brain structure in existence. And the brain stem is made up of three main parts. You have the the medulla, the pons, and the reticular formation. And so location-wise, the brain stem is kind of like back here. It's at the tippy top of your spinal cord, and it's kind of what goes up into your brain and connects like the spinal cord from the brain. And so the brain stem is responsible for our most basic life-sustaining functions, our heart rate, our breathing. The things that our brainstem does requires really no conscious thought. Like I could live without the rest of my brain. I would be in a vegetative state. I wouldn't have conscious thought, but I would be alive physically. My heart would be beating. I would be breathing. So the brainstem keeps us alive, but it's not what like makes us human, right? With our conscious thought and things like that. So the medulla in particular is responsible for like heart rate and breathing and regulating those things. The reticular formation is in response to arousal. So they've done studies where they've taken like a sleeping cat and they've like stimulated the reticular formation, and they're immediately alert and awake. So the reticular formation has to do with arousal. And so if I like snipped your reticular formation, you would like fall into a coma. You would lose that ability to be alert and aroused. And then the pons has to do with sleep and coordinating movement. And I don't know that you're going to need to know like specifically how they're all like layered in the brainstem, but the reticular formation's on top. But I just think you need to know more so the basic structure, that the brainstem's right here, and then how the other pieces kind of come around, which we'll talk about. So that's the brainstem. That's like the oldest part of the brain. And again, it's all of just our basic life-sustaining functions, but no real conscious thought or awareness. Then we have the thalamus, which kind of sits on top of the brainstem. And the thalamus is our sensory control center. So it's where all of our visual stimuli are routed and processed. And so any sort of sensory stimuli, it doesn't mean it's only processed there, but it goes through there and then gets sent, routed to the right spots of the brain, and then the output's routed through there as well. Thing that they sometimes try to like maybe trick you with is that the thalamus is the sensory control center for everything except, does anybody know in the chat? I'm going to hold you on the edge of your seats for a second. What sense is not in the thalamus, not processed in the thalamus? Anybody know? Nope, it's not sight. It's actually smell, which is just like a weird random thing. For some reason, smell doesn't get routed through the thalamus. Sight is also routed through the occipital lobe, so it is processed somewhere else as well, but it does go through the thalamus first. So that can be a little bit tricky because, like I said, there's multiple parts of the brain that do with multiple things. So our thalamus is where all of our sensory input goes except smell. I would like highlight that, underline that in your notes or something, because they'll probably try and like sneak that in there and you'll have to pay attention and be like, oh, nope, I know smell doesn't go there. And then the other older brain structure is the cerebellum, and that kind of also sits on like either side of the brain stem. And so the cerebellum has to do with like purposeful movement. So like, again, when we're talking about like the robot, right? Those purposeful movements, it's not the automatic reflex type things. It's like if I'm purposely playing the guitar, the cerebellum is helping me do that, or riding a bike. And it also has to do with like nonverbal learning. And that would also be like riding a bike, right? You don't have to like talk or like think about words to ride a bike. It's like a memory, almost like a muscle memory thing. And so the cerebellum helps with that. And so kind of muscle memory, movement, balance. If your cerebellum was injured, you might be able to walk, but it would be really like jerky and kind of tipsy. You might have trouble like holding a pen or pencil and like writing, things like that. And so the cerebellum helps us with some of those coordinated type movements. So those three are like the older brain structures, the brainstem, the cerebellum, and the thalamus. And then the limbic system is kind of the middle one. It's not the most new, most developed brain structure, but it's definitely newer than the brainstem. And so the limbic system has to do with like our emotions and reactions and things like that. And there's three main parts that you need to know of the limbic system. The amygdala, and it's pronounced amygdala. Some people say Amy Dagala, which is not a person's name. It's the amygdala. And the amygdala is aggression, A and A. That's how I remember it. But it basically helps us process emotion. Amygdala, though, and aggression, it's more aggression and fear. So A and A is how I tend to remember that. But you could also just say emotion in general in regards to the amygdala. The hippocampus, we're not going to talk a ton about in this unit because we do a whole unit on memory. And so then we're going to talk all about the ins and outs of the hippocampus. But just knowing that hippocampus is associated with memory, and this might not work for you because your brain probably works differently than mine. But like if you think about an elephant never forgets, and then I, for some reason, sometimes think of a hippo like an elephant, and you never forget because it's your memory. Kind of a stretch, but it works for me. I don't know why I sometimes envision a hippo and an elephant as the same thing, but it helps me remember that hippocampus has to do with memory. And then the last part of the limbic system is the hypothalamus. And within the hypothalamus is that pituitary gland that we talked about previously. So the hypothalamus is our maintenance and reward system. So it's what tells me that I'm hungry, or what tells me that I'm thirsty, or if my body temperature, it helps try to regulate my body temperature and keep it in check. And so the hypothalamus is all about keeping me in homeostasis. I'm not too hot, I'm not too cold, I'm not too hungry, whatever. And it's also the reward system in the brain. So thinking about like sex hormones and things that are released, you might, in your cortex, which we'll talk about a little bit later, be like see a picture of someone that you find attractive, and then your hypothalamus is going to kick in and start sending out those sex hormones to your body, and it's going to like trigger reactions from you. And so that's one thing I think that's important, is that it's not like each of these pieces of the brain are doing separate things. They all work together and create a system that functions. So just kind of keep that in mind. It's not like this only does this and that only does that. They're all working together, but you're just kind of having to memorize the gist of what those things are. So the hypothalamus then is where the pituitary gland is located. And we said that's our master gland, which then sends messages to all other parts of our brain. But the other thing that the hypothalamus is our reward center. And there was this really interesting study that some scientists did, and it actually came about by accident. They were implanting an electrode in the brain of a rat, and they were studying something else, but they put the electrode in the wrong spot. And what they found was every time they stimulated the electrode, the rat was having like a kind of like a positive reaction, and it was because they accidentally put the electrode in the hypothalamus. So what they ended up doing was they gave the rat a button, and if the rat pushed the button, it would trigger the pleasure or reward center in its brain, making it feel good. Basically, it's like your feel-good center. And so they wanted to see if the rat would start to associate that feeling good with pressing that button. And so the rats would actually like just sit there and like hit the button back and forth, like hit it, hit it, hit it, hit it. And they'd be like, ooh, their brains were lighting up and it felt really good. And so they would like do that until they'd like pass out from exhaustion. And so that's kind of how we started to discover that the hypothalamus was a reward center in the brain, was by an accidental electrode placed on a rat. And then the rats kind of showed us that they were willing to like keep feeling that like feel good feeling to the point of like passing out from exhaustion. So that's just like an interesting little tidbit to kind of help you remember that. let me see. So that is it for limbic system. And then we move on to the cortices, the cortexes. And those are like the more advanced parts of our brain. They're like considered the newest structures. And those are the things that really like make us human, I think, especially the association areas. But let's start with the frontal lobes. We're going to work our way kind of backwards in our brain. So the frontal lobes are located like right here, like behind your forehead, frontal lobes, right? And the frontal lobes are responsible for like planning and problem solving, making good judgment, those sorts of things. Interesting fact, that is the last part of your brain that like finishes growing. So you guys as teenagers actually don't have fully developed frontal lobes yet. So that's why when like, oh, teenagers, they make dumb decisions and peer pressure, stuff like that, right? Well, you have an excuse. It's literally because your brain isn't capable of like fully like making good plans and judgment yet. The other parts of your brain, like the reward center, like the hypothalamus, are taking over and leading you to make bad decisions because your frontal lobe hasn't completely developed and you don't have a strong like sense of judgment and planning yet all the way. And that actually doesn't finish developing until like your early 20s. So you have an excuse the next time your parents yell at you for making a bad decision that your frontal lobe, you can't help it. It's just what it is. So that's the frontal lobe, the planning, the judgment. There's other stuff involved, but that's what you need to know, the gist of it. And then if we move backwards, we've got the parietal lobes. So they sit like back here. So it's frontal lobe, parietal lobe towards the top of your head. The parietal lobe is our like sensory center as well. So the thalamus and the parietal lobe have to do with some of our sensory cortex, things like that. Specifically touch and body position. So the thalamus would route like the feelings of touch to that part of your brain to be processed. That's really all you have to know for parietal lobes. Then moving on, which area would we do next? Probably the occipital lobes. The occipital lobes sit then below the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe is further down in the back. And the occipital lobe is vision. That's really the only thing that you need to associate with the occipital lobe. So the thalamus takes any visual information and sends it to the occipital lobe. The occipital lobe also does some stuff with the vision and then sends the input out. And when I'm saying like this processing is happening, we know that our senses process information in a split second. So when we talk about it, it sounds like this long process, but our bodies are really quick and speedy in doing that. After the occipital lobe, we move to the temporal lobes, which are like right here by our ears. And because they're by our ears, it has to do with like hearing, which is I think an easy way to remember that. The other thing might be like tempo in music. Temporal, tempo might help you, I don't know, remember and associate those two. And then the motor cortex kind of sits right here. And that has to do with movement. And then for that, I would say like motor and movement, M-O and M-O. That's how I remember motor goes with movement. Or like if you've ever heard someone say like fine motor skills, that's referencing like movement as well. So I just really like this diagram because I think it really just sums up what you need to know about the brain, and it groups it by systems as well. So I think that is also pretty useful. And then, I didn't talk about association areas. And association areas are just kind of like what really sets us apart, I think, from like other animals and other species. And those are like our higher mental functions. So really like critical thinking and like imagination, like all those different things. Like the association areas are just kind of this general area that gives us our higher level mental processes. All right. Any questions about any of those parts of the brain? You can throw them in the ask a question part. Otherwise, we're going to move on and talk a little bit about what happens with brain specialization or hemispheric specialization. Okay, so this is something that sometimes is confusing for kids, but I'm not sure if you've learned about this in your classes, but sitting on top of our brain is like a network of nerves that connects my left brain and my right brain together. And I can actually cut that network of nerves. It's called the corpus callosum. and I can cut that. And the only thing it really does is it prevents my left brain and my right brain from talking to each other. So I could live a relatively normal life with a split brain. And that's what we call it, as a split brain, because your brain is not communicating with one another anymore. And so basically, different parts of our brain specialize in different things. And what you need to know is that the left brain has to do with language, L and L, left language. Left hemisphere has to do with language. And then it controls the right side of our body. So that's kind of just an interesting thing, is that the left side of my brain always controls the right side of my body over here. And then the right side of my brain controls the left side of my body. So it's opposite. And so in a split brain patient, the brain isn't communicating, and it's really cool. If you want to look it up, the guy's name is Michael Gazzaniga, and he has done studies with patients where they've cut the corpus callosum, which is connecting the brain, and seen basically like the brain doesn't talk to each other, and it's almost like it's two separate people. So like what's shown up here on the pictures, I could show you a circle in your left visual field, but you would not be able to tell me that you saw a circle because my left eye processes information in the right brain, but my right brain doesn't do language. So I wouldn't be able to tell you that I saw a circle. However, my right side of my brain can do what? It can move my left hand, so I could actually draw a circle with my left hand. I wouldn't verbally be able to tell you that I saw the circle, but I could indicate with that left side of my body that I saw it. And if I also showed you a triangle, except in your right visual field, so your right eye sees the triangle, that would go to the left side of your brain. And because the left side of my brain deals with language, I would say, oh, I saw a triangle. And so what's interesting, and you maybe have to watch the video to really get the full gist of this, is that they can show patients these things, and like one part of their body is like, oh, I saw a triangle, and the other part of their body is like, oh, I saw a circle, because the two halves of the brain don't actually talk. Why would I cut someone's brain like this? It kind of seems like, why would you do that? Basically, people who maybe have like severe seizures, there's too much like electrochemical things going on in the brain. There's too much firing. In extreme cases, they might actually cut the corpus callosum, and it helps reduce seizures. And so then we see people with this split brain. I think it's fascinating. Sometimes it's a little confusing because you have to get that left, right down. So typically what I do when I encounter a question about a split brain is I actually draw it out like it is here. I put whatever it is they're telling me I'm seeing on the left side, and then I draw an arrow to like the right side of my body, and I write down what I would actually see and experience. All right, split brain. A couple other things to do with genetics, and then we're going to move on. So I also have an FRQ kind of practice today. We might have to cut that a little bit short. But behavior genetics then takes all of this bioinformation that we have about the brain, about neurons, about neurotransmitters, and genetics, and it basically studies then how big of an influence our genetics have versus our environment. And so that's the big question in psych all of the time is it more nature or is it more nurture? Is it more environment? Is it more genetics? And so behavior genetics attempts to answer that question. How much of something comes from your environment? How much of it is shaped by just the way you were born? And so the big thing that comes out of behavior genetics is heritability. And this is something that kids confuse all the time. And so I want to be really explicit and clear about this. Heritability is the extent to which variation among individuals in a group is due to their differing genes. So if I say that intelligence is 50% heritable, that does not mean that you inherit 50% of your intelligence. Please be clear on that. That is not what that means. It means that 50% of the differences that exist between us, or the variations between our intelligence, can be explained due to genetic factors. So it's not telling you the percent that you inherited. It's explaining the differences that exist amongst people based on genetics. So it's usually a percentage, like a mathematical estimate. And so this image, I think, does a really good job of demonstrating heritability. So on the left side, we have seeds A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. If we give them all of the same lighting, so they're in a 100% lighting, they all have the same lighting. And if you look underneath there, it says they're in a normal nutrient-filled soil. So they're in the exact same soil and they're in the exact same lighting. So their environment is 100% the same. But all of those don't grow the same. B is shorter than A. D is a little taller than B. So why are they different heights? Well, we can say then that heritability is 100% explainable for the differences that exist. Because we were able to create a 100% uniform environment for these seeds to grow in, then the differences that exist must be due to genetic factors. That's 100% heritability. On the right-hand side, again, we have the same seeds, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And we have the same exact lighting, but this time they're grown in a soil that's deficient. It's not very good. And so you can see seed A didn't grow very high. Seed B didn't grow very high. And so if we compare seed A on the left side to seed A on the right side, why is there a difference there? It's due to genetic and heritable, or in that case, it's due to environmental factors, because there's a difference in the environment that's being created. So if we're comparing left to right, those are environmental differences that we're seeing. But if we're comparing the seeds within one thing, those are heritable differences, because that's what's causing the differences, even they're grown in the same environment. Does that make sense? The part I want you to really key in on is that it's the differences, the variation. It's not, oh, I inherit 50% of my intelligence. Another way to look at it is this. This chart shows like different environments. George lives in a deprived environment. Maybe he lives in a really low income household. He doesn't have access to books or proper nutrition. And so George inherits a range, that's what the bars show, a range of possible intelligence scores. And then his environment places him somewhere along that range. And because he lives in a deprived environment, he doesn't reach his fullest potential. He's at the lower end of his heritable range of intelligence. Whereas LaToya at the top, her inherited range is really wide. And LaToya lives in an enriched environment, so her parents can afford tutors. She's always eaten healthy, good food growing up. She's always had access to all of the best schools and things like that. And so her heritable range, she's ending up that dot closer to the top of her range because her environment allowed her to reach her fullest potential. So yeah, that's kind of the gist of heritability. It's kind of taking in the factors of the genetics and as well as then looking at how the environment influences those. So we have a question. The question says, backtracking a little bit to the corpus callosum, it doesn't just throw someone into a vegetative state. It just halts communication, and that is correct. Yep, I couldn't, because I would probably do it poorly, but someone could cut your corpus callosum and you would still be alive and functioning and perfectly or mostly fine. And basically it just stops my brain from talking to both sides. And so I'll throw that name. It's Michael Gazzaniga in the chat. If you want to look him up, there's some short videos. He did like a 60-minute special a while ago. And he talks about the corpus callosum and his experiment. So check it out if that is interesting to you. All right, so let's answer this question just really quick in the chat. So as environments become more similar, heredity as a source of differences becomes, is it more or less important? What do you guys think it is? Oh, I don't know what the show sensate is. I'm going to have to look that up. Is that like a, anyone have an answer for that? Otherwise, I'll throw it out there. As environments become more similar, heredity as a source of differences becomes more important, because if I could make and raise people in like an identical environment and differences were still there, then it has to be heritable factors that are causing those differences to exist. So just kind of keeping that in mind. The last thing then is looking at how genes and environment interact. Basically, we can't isolate one or the other. That's the gist of it. We never can isolate nature and we can never isolate nurture. And so we get into this kind of debate of like, which comes first? Is it your genes or is it your environment? And so one example of this would be looking at this cute little baby right here. The baby's genes have made it attractive. It's a social, cute, smiley little baby. It's easygoing. It doesn't cry a lot. Therefore, in its environment, it gets more affection, more love, more positive attention. Because it's a happy, smiley baby, people respond to it in happy, smiley ways. And so its genetics are influencing its environment. Just like if it was a crying, sad, angry little baby all the time genetically, its interactions with other humans might be more negative. It's not like someone's going to be mean to the baby, but it might not have as positive of interactions. And so if this cute, attractive, socially outgoing baby gets more positive attention in its environment, then the baby ends up growing up to be a warmer, more outgoing person. So can we say it was the genes or can we say it was the environment? And in reality, it's a mix of both. And so we have to always consider both factors with gene and environment interaction. All right, free response question. We are definitely not going to get through the whole free response question, but that's okay. Let's do the first 2 terms tonight. Just some reminders. I'm going to always go through these, but the free response question is always going to ask you to chug soda. So remember to be concise in your writing. This is not an essay. We're not being verbose with what we're talking about. Use good handwriting and use a pen. Always underline the term that you're talking about, and then get rid of all that extra stuff. We don't need an intro. We don't need a conclusion. And then for the actual writing part, make sure you leave a space between paragraphs. You always should write in order. Define the term, apply the term, and use synonyms when possible. So just always remember that chug sodas FRQ. And so today's question would be about Joe. See if you can start to formulate a response. You don't necessarily have to type it in the chat, but see if you can come up. We'll do the first 2 terms tonight. So as you're reading it, think about how you would respond to the prompt. Joe was involved in a car accident that smashed in the left side of his head. His left ear is damaged completely, and he will probably lose vision in his left eye. His whole right side was completely untouched. He is currently in an induced coma, but doctors know that he will survive. However, they are not able to fully assess what will be affected and how Joe will function when he awakens. Speculate how each of the following aspects of the brain and nervous system could influence Joe's recovery in the coming weeks and months. State how Joe will be affected and how he will function. And then you would use endorphins and brain plasticity specifically. So you're going to write about endorphins. You're going to start by just defining the term. So endorphins are, and then write your definition. And then you have to apply it to the situation. So you need to talk about how endorphins are going to influence Joe's recovery. It could be a good thing, it could be a bad thing, but you have to discuss how endorphins would do that. So I'll give you a second to think about it, like 30 more seconds, and then I'm going to flip to my response. All right. So my definition and my whole thing. Endorphins are natural opiates that are released in the body in response to pain or vigorous exercise. Boom. Definition. Done. Now how do I apply it to Joe and his damaged brain? In Joe's case, his endorphins may help him feel better as he awakens, which would help him begin his road to recovery. So I have related endorphins to Joe being in pain. The fact that they're going to relieve his pain might help him on his road to recovery. You could also put that maybe the endorphins are going to not be enough because he is in such a severe car accident that he might need extra help to feel better, like prescription medication. And so sometimes with an FRQ, there's no right or wrong argument to make, as long as the argument that you're making is logical and that it makes sense. You could really argue either way with Joe on this one, that the endorphins will help him feel better, and so thus speed up his recovery process, or because it's such a severe injury, it might not be enough. Brain plasticity then. Brain plasticity refers to the ability of the brain to change and adapt in response to experiences, sometimes even in response to a traumatic brain injury. Definition. You literally can start like every point of your FRQ just flat out saying the definition. Endorphins are, brain plasticity is, hemispheric specialization is. Just flat out define it. You don't have to get fancy. Now, specifically, how would brain plasticity help Joe in his recovery? In Joe's case, brain plasticity could help him recover from his injuries. For example, since the left side of his brain was injured, he may have trouble with language. So there I'm applying my knowledge of the left side of the brain and what it does to the question. But with brain plasticity, other parts of his brain may be able to take over and regain his capacity for language. So I'm taking my knowledge of brain plasticity, saying like different parts of the brain can actually like help grow and do other things. And I'm talking about how that might help Joe, particularly with the left side of his brain that was damaged. This would be likely the younger that Joe is. You could also say if Joe's an old man, brain plasticity might not help him because brains are less likely to do that the older that you are. So again, you could argue either side. You just have to be logical about what you are saying in the argument. That is all we really have time to cover tonight. We're going to reach out, I think, if you guys are all registered, I'm assuming with your email addresses. I want to get some feedback just about the topics that we're covering. If you guys are like happy about the way that we're headed with what the schedule looks like, or if you want me to skip ahead a little bit so that we're like more in sync. I know it kind of depends. Like my school year didn't start until September, so my students are not even in the bio unit yet. So it really depends where you are. But I'd like to get us to a place that we all are kind of in a good spot benefiting from this. So watch for an email from Amanda from Fiveable, and she might reach out about kind of where we're at in this. And so again, if you're enjoying this, make sure you follow the Crowdcast Twitter and then on YouTube, and our Facebook page is really useful. It hasn't been super active lately, but if you ever have questions, there's plenty of us on there. Like if you can't wait till Tuesday to ask me a question, you can always do that. Otherwise, I will see you next week. I hope you guys have a great week. Bye.